Okay, so this is sort of like something that might be interesting to people that are interested in sort of like big data kinds of things. It's a project much more along those lines. So essentially what this is an attempt to take the entire congressional record, which is everything that's been said in Congress, and we go back to 1870, and we digitized it all, and then we treated the text as data, and like counted the number of phrases of 3-word phrases, and tried to use this to construct a measure of political polarization going back to 1870. And so it's because everybody's talking about how American politics is ridiculously polarized and nobody can get along, and we decided to see, can you go back historically and sort of see patterns, is the United States are we actually unusually polarized, or is this just kind of the normal way American politics is, and just how does this compare historically? And then particularly what we're interested in is not just how politicians are polarized, but we're going to use Google Ngrams and Google Books as a way to sort of get a sense of how polarized the overall culture, the intellectual culture is, and compare that to Congress. So that's kind of the idea, is going to be to like analyze large chunks of phrases and track this relationship between like ideological language in Congress and the larger sort of intellectual culture. Okay, so what do? We're going to extract what we consider partisan and polarized phrases from the congressional record for each Congress by looking at the correlation of phrase usage with the political party of the speaker. So the idea is that if Republicans disproportionately use a given phrase, we're going to call that phrase Republican. And if Democrats disproportionately use a given phrase, we're going to call that phrase Democrat. And then we're going to go look at those phrases in Google Ngrams, which if you haven't played with yet, you should all play with it. You can lose hours. Do you guys know about Google Ngrams?
Vaguely.
Vaguely? Oh my god, I should just show you right now. Ngrams. Okay, so this is my favorite thing to do in all my classes, is like correlation, causation. So the reason I love this is that, so this is essentially the frequency with which this word appears in all of Google Books, which is digitized books going back to 1800. And so this is the frequency of this term in all the books that they've digitized. And they've digitized like Stanford's library, Harvard's library, Berkeley's library. I'm not sure if they've gotten Columbia's, but maybe. And so what I love about this one is particularly like, well, see, look, the use of the term correlation increases over time, but not the use of the term causation, which suggests that correlation does not imply causation, as you can tell by the correlation. Okay, so that's what we're doing. So we're taking the data behind that viewer, and we're going to look at it. And so, so then we're going to count the occurrences of these phrases in Google Ngrams by year. And then we're going to use these to construct measures of partisanship, of polarization, and we're going to look at them in Congress, but then we're also going to be able to look at like how politicized Google Books appears by scoring it along the dimensions that we score Congress. And then what we can also do is we can check to see if Congress like leads or lags books in developing language, particularly partisan language. Yeah.
So when you say that you're going to correlate the phrase usage with the political, with the speaker,
yep.
Like, are you also expecting it to sort of negatively compare with the other party?
So we're going to look at those phrases that just have, like, you'll see what we do. We're going to look at those phrases that have the most strong correlation in one direction or the other. So if it's really strongly correlated with being Democrat, we're going to call that Democrat. But they don't necessarily have to be negatively correlated with the other side. They just have to be positively correlated with this one side.
But couldn't like potentially, I don't know, I mean, so obviously like say the Democrats and the Republicans have really different views, or maybe they don't anymore, but on like the war on terror or something,
yeah.
Right? But they're both going to be saying it a lot.
So that's totally true, and that's like a limitation of this approach. But one of the things I'll point out is that they actually use very different language for it. So like we'll see one of the phrases is like death tax versus estate tax. Guess who uses death tax? Yeah, so we'll see that even when they're talking about the same issue, they use very different language, and those differences is what our methodology is going to be picking up. Yeah.
Well, can you also do correlation like with specific criteria, so you can create more context for that correlation?
Yeah. So one of the issues is that we wanted to do this. It was partly like I was trying to learn this methodologies and stuff, and we're trying to do this in a way that doesn't involve making as few judgment calls of our own as possible. And so the idea is to let the data tell us commit to a methodology and let the data tell us what it is. And so we couldn't think of a way of doing that was sort of like totally hands-off and would involve some sort of judgment calls. So we're like, we didn't do that. I think obviously future work should do that. We're going to take very coarse representations of language here, and you could imagine much more sophisticated representations of language. So the thing I think I'm going to show you if I get to it is I'm in the middle of a project where we do very similar methodology for scoring economics articles on whether or not you can sign economics articles as sounding relatively right-wing or left-wing. Because science. So, yeah. Skip this. Yeah.
What was your definition of the phrase itself? Like, how did you...
So we're going to do 2 words. So I'll tell you, we're going to use 2-word and 3-word sequences. Okay, so here's what we do. We take this basic method is pretty common in natural language processing. What we do is we take the plain text of the Congressional record, which we got from Columbia Library's subscription to Hein Online, and part of it anyway. And we extracted the speeches for each speaker in the House by Congress. So it comes as giant plain text, but every time somebody's speaking, they gives like name, Democrat, made of Massachusetts is like a thing, and so we just find all of those and like take the subsequent text and assign that to each speaker. And so then what we do is we stem the speech, and so what that involves is running an algorithm called a Porter stemmer that essentially strips out all the punctuation, and it represents words as root words, so that for taxes, taxing, taxation, all get reduced down to tax. And this is because otherwise the data set's just way too sparse, there's way too many words, so by collapsing things to root words, you sort of can like make the data set manageable. And then we're going to represent our speech segments as counts of 3 consecutive words. So we experimented with two consecutive words, but we're going to focus on 3 consecutive words, and these are called trigrams. And so, for example, capital gains taxes get represented as capital gain taxes. And we drop trigrams that appear less than 2,000 times in the Google corpus, just because there's not enough power to say anything else otherwise. And so then what we can do is represent each Congress as this giant matrix of like all of these phrases, and then for each phrase, and then for each congressperson, we have an entry that tells you how many times that congressman used that phrase in that Congress. And that's the raw data. And then we match that to data on each House member's party, Democrat and Republican. And so essentially, we didn't have to do this, it turned out, at the end, but we did it at the beginning, was to like restrict attention to phrases that were relatively frequent and sort of more used by one party. And so we restricted attention to the top 10,000 in each Congress according to this chi-squared metric that I'm not going to get into, but no.
Wait, so is it, what are the years of the data?
1870 to 2007.
So how do you account for the like basic complete reversal of parties?
We're going to let the data. We're going to do it separately, Congress by Congress. So we're going to do each of. Sorry.
But even though like in the 30s, like the parties were so divided that like there were basically people on each side.
Yeah. So
saying
we're basically going to see, can we see that show up in how they're talking?
Okay. Right.
And let's see. Yeah.
So you're just finding a sort of polarization measure for each individual Congress or compared to this. You're not saying like where are Democrats, where are Republicans over time.
Well, you can. It's hard to sort of think about how to compare this over time, actually. So, yeah. So the essentially measures like what we can compare is essentially the strength of the correlation of phrases with party ID. And so the idea is that when you actually see more polarization, as we're going to define it, means that essentially it's like parties are talking past each other more. is how you should think about our polarization. That there's a lot more phrases that are way more highly correlated with Republicans and Democrats. So that's sort of like there's not a lot of there's not a lot of phrases that are getting used by both parties.
Did you have control for just like the body of like? I imagine there was probably less records to like go through for like earlier Congresses. Like, so how are you able to?
Yeah, it's a problem. So we don't, because we just sort of take what we've got. I mean, everything is done sort of separately by year. So to the extent that what it should, you'll see it when we do our out of sample things. We just get like big fat, much fatter standard errors on the earlier things because there's less data to work with and it's noisier. And the typos, there's like a lot more typos in the earlier Congresses, and so we have to fix some of them, but can't fix all of them. So so essentially, for each phrase, we calculate the correlation of frequency with the party of the speaker, and so this is just like so this is going to be. This is just a correlation measure because this F and this party are standardized to be between, to have variance 1 and mean 0. Both of these, and so to get the correlation you can just sum across, so you're summing across House members, and you're basically looking at the correlation of the frequency of use with the party of that House, of that House member. And so this, actually this table isn't, this is just like the most significant phrases in each year from 1873 to, I guess this got cut off in 1911. So this is actually not terribly, although, you see stuff like the gold standard and the tariff coming up as like Democrat phrases in the late 19th century, which is exactly what the Democrats were obsessed with. And so, and then you sort of see like 1991, defend Saudi Arabia. So these are the Republican phrases, and so this is stuff like 1 million illegal aliens, lower tax rate, higher tax bracket, the free enterprise system. Democrats love Martin Luther King, and they talk about Martin Luther King, Black History Month, defend Saudi Arabia, civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, education and healthcare. So here, let me show this as word clouds. So this is like the red phrases are the Democrat ones. The blue phrases are the Republican. The red phrases are. You know how this goes. So I like this one. It's like the umbilical cord blood is here. It's the stem cell debate in 2007. And the Wall Street Journal, they like to cite the Wall Street Journal. Al-Qaeda leader, so those are Republican phrases. Democrat phrases include education and healthcare, Martin Luther King, greenhouse gas emissions, minimum wage is here somewhere, minimum wage worker, global climate change. So like, you can sort of see that, so one of the nice things is that for the Congresses that we're familiar with, this method, and we didn't do any filtering, this is just what the algorithm spits out, and you can, it's like, roughly makes sense. And so it makes us think that the things that it's recovering going back is then also going to make sense. And this is 1875, where you get essentially, I don't know why these phrases come up. I have no idea. I mean, I know a lot of history of this period. I still have no idea why people are using United States approval, received United States. I can guess this is the United States colored troops, because this is Reconstruction.
Were the Republicans advocating for free public school?
Yes, this is the 1870s, where the Republicans are the.
They were exactly the opposite.
Really?
Yeah, this is where this is the party of Lincoln. So yeah, you can see that here. So yeah, the Republicans are really into free public schools. And this is 1897, where like the Republicans are much more into like the protecting American industry, yeah, I mean that's the only thing I hear.
Are these top 1,000 by like strength of correlation or by number of times used?
So we did it both ways. These are by the strength of correlation. they're not necessarily very related
So
to.
having a lot of red words here means that there's a lot more like strongly Republican phrases than strongly
Yeah, this is 1913. Cheap foreign labor. This is great. This is like when the Federal Reserve is invented, and so you can see them debating the Federal Reserve. This line, protecting American industry. Republicans between like 1890 and like 1920. This is what they really love. Is like they're all about the tariff as a thing. So just in case that you ever meet a free trader that's like the U.S. the U.S. During its period of development was not doing anything closely related to free trade. Okay, and so this is like right before the New Deal. You don't really see much here. 1949. I love this. The Ku Klux Klan shows up. And Chinese national, yeah. So a strong nation's defense. I think you start seeing Cold War sort of stuff. Algorithms. For those of you that, attack South Korea. And so this is 1963, where clearly the most democratic thing you could say is John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Adjusted gross income.
What?
And adjusted gross income.
And adjusted gross income. That's
a Republican phrase.
Yeah.
I actually be curious about the 60s would be an interesting time to check out because, well, there's polarization, but it's not strictly on party lines, right? Because it's more.
Yeah. So it's something we could do with this data, and there's lots of stuff to do with this data. So it's basically a cottage industry for graduate students. But one of the things is we're just looking at party, but we know a ton of things about congressmen. And you could use any characteristic of congressmen to score these phrases exactly the same way, and figure out what phrases are, more southern, or do women speak differently in Congress, or all sorts of things. So there's actually a graduate student who's working on trying to find out if the speech changes in election years, by trying to find out what phrases are differentially used in election years versus non-election years. This is 1979. Oil is a big issue. This is 2001. Saddam Hussein is a big issue. You see death tax, paid death tax.
Iran hostage crisis.
Where is that?
Yeah.
On the left side.
They're bringing it up again.
What did you use for bringing words to their roots? Did you find somewhere that had?
Yeah. So this is this Porter stemmer. It's like it's an algorithm sort of standard in natural language processing that sort of people just kind of use to condense text to a simpler
Does it just look things up in the dictionary, or does it just somehow chop things off?
It just chops things off. So it'll make a chunk of mistakes. But on average, this is why this sort of methodology only works when you have thousands and thousands of documents, is because you've got a ton of noise, and so to get a signal out of that noise, you just need a large sample. So this is the idea that we'd like to see how many. Can we predict your party based on just your speech using this method? And this is the fraction that we get correct every year, and so it's from 85% to close to 99%. We do okay. We can predict your party based on your speech, given the fact that we've scored your speech by your party. So this is kind of it's not the toughest test, to be fair. This is average partisanship by Congress. So this is Republicans and this is Democrats, and so you see what I do find interesting is that you have these spikes in the Democrats in 1913 and 1937, and this 1913 thing is this is when progressivism sort of wins. So you get the income tax. So basically, the income tax finally becomes part of the Constitution, that you can finally have an income tax. The Federal Reserve gets invented. in 1913 is also when the Senate finally gets opened up to like direct elections, and so this is a bunch essentially this is a bunch of wins for the Democrats and losses for the Republicans in 1913. And 1937 is this other set of giant losses for the Republicans. It's like the New Deal sort of 2.0. It sort of gets going in 1937, and I do think it's interesting that like you see these movements in the Republicans in these sort of two years of big defeat is when they sort of like close ranks, and you don't see something similar in say the Democrats. In 1948, the Democrats have a big loss in policy terms, and yet they you don't see very much action.
So how is that score computed? This
So this average partisanship is like the average. So we score each person's partisanship by the language that they use, and then we average over all the Democrats to get the Democrat score, and all the Republicans to get the Republican score.
Is that just like the fraction of the phrases they use that are considered to be partisan?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Or it's like, well, it's not just the fraction. It's we're also weighting that phrase by the strength of the correlation.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to define polarization as the absolute value of partisanship. So the idea is that you can be a partisan Republican or a partisan Democrat. We take the absolute value of that. So Democrat, here left is Democrat, so it's negative, and right is Republican and positive. But if we take the absolute value of it, then we can get what we think of as partisanship, distance from zero. And so we're going to then construct aggregate partisanship in the whole country and every year by summing these frequency-weighted partisan and polarization scores. So to just make this clear, we're going to take the strength of the correlation of a phrase with party, take its absolute value, and then add that up across all the phrases, weighting each one by the frequency of its appearance. And so this, and then we're going to do the same thing for Google Ngrams. This is just the formulas for that. This is just like partisanship is just adding up. So this beta is the correlation of the phrase with party, and so we're going to add up all of those correlations, weighting by the frequency with which that phrase appears. But then when we want polarization, we're going to add up the absolute value of that correlation weighted by the frequency scores. So this is sort of like to check that we actually got something that made sense. So what we did is that we looked at just the phrases in our Google Ngrams. We looked at the frequency of phrases that are highly polarized. We looked at the polarization of phrases in Google Ngrams that had anything to do with taxes. And then we looked then at a separate, like the Gallup polling company does measures essentially how much people hate taxes. And so we basically constructed the same constructed a measure of the strength of anti-tax sentiment in Gallup, and sort of checked that it roughly correlates with the extent to which tax phrases, polarizing tax phrases, are showing up in Google Ngrams. So it's like, it's not perfect, but they're pretty well correlated. And so this red line, I'm going to show you a bunch of these red lines. This is this other measure of political polarization that's been constructed. It's called the DW Nominate score, and it essentially shows how much like people are voting along party lines and roll call votes in the House. And so we're just sort of showing that to compare our measure to. And so what you get is that if you look in Congress, you get this massive increase in polarization, both in Congress if you measure it by our text measure, which is the blue dots, and if you measure it by the roll call voting, which is the red line. So it's like, yes, Congress is more polarized now than it's been in a long time. But if you look at Google sort of Ngrams, you sort of get that it's, there's maybe a bit of an increase around here. So we can only go up to 2000 with Google Ngrams because the data isn't reliable after 2000. So maybe there's limits on what we can say. But essentially, it doesn't look like you're seeing the steep uptick in polarization. So So the idea is that it might be that Congress was really polarized, but you're not sort of seeing that in at least the corpus of things that are getting written in books. Yeah.
When you looked at engrams, were you just using phrases that you'd already identified as highly correlated within the congressional text, or were you running new analysis to find phrases that were partisan and somehow identifying authors as either Republican?
Yeah, we didn't have anything with authors. We just had the raw counts.
Okay, so you just used the phrases that you already had. Okay.
Yeah.
So have you thought of a way yet to sort of see if there are like, you know, intellectual culture phrases that are particularly partisan, and sort of see if, like, because I guess what Grant is getting at is that maybe the language that you use in Congress is fundamentally different than the language you would use in books, and maybe there could still be partisanship with different.
Absolutely. So, I mean, like I said, that's sort of something else to be done. Is to, I mean, one of the things we were trying to get data on, and we never did, was to get like a corpus of think tank reports, and then score like the language coming out of think tank reports, and then look at how that diffuses both into Congress and into Google Books, for example. So that there's lots of other sources of political speech, and you can use this methodology to go after lots of them.
Wouldn't there be another problem with if this corpus was increasing every year because people are publishing more and more things, and less of those things are related to politics, so that the frequency of these phrases would just decrease all over time?
Well, so I mean, but remember, we're normalizing by the frequency. So when we calculate these things, we're dividing by the sum of the frequencies of those phrases. So in every period, we're sort of renormalizing by the overall frequencies in those things. So at least at that level, I think we've got everything. We're scaling everything relative to the size of the corpus. And it's absolutely true that the corpus just increases over time. It's one of the reasons actually you have to cut the data off at 2000 is because after 2000 actually Google Books comes online, and so then publishers start releasing things directly into the corpus as digital texts, and so the composition of the corpus just totally changes because you can now, anything that was digitally published, and all these book publishers started giving their stuff to Google, that all then got added into the corpus, and we have no idea what the composition of that is. So we know that the pre-2000 stuff is all coming out of university libraries, so we can at least like limit the sample that way. You know, all that stuff that's in university libraries. So we were just like kind of like, let's futz around and see what predicts this this polarization measure. And so we're going to look particularly in Google Ngrams. So we think this is interesting as a measure of like the political polarization inherent in like the culture at large. And what's interesting is that when you look at domestic political violence, that seems to be the most robust predictor of cultural political polarization. So these years of Reconstruction are like lots of lynchings, lots of strikes. All of this sort of late 19th century is just periods of enormous both labor and racial violence at home, and they tend to be associated with periods of high like political polarization in the written word. We looked at the military sort of stuff. We didn't get very much. So this is military casualties. You don't get a very strong effect. Yeah.
On this one, it looks like, is there some sort of transform that you could do to make it look nicer? Like I'm thinking like the log or something might make it look a little bit clearer.
Log might. I mean, I agree. It looks concave. I mean, the reason you would take a log is often if you were like worried that your variable was not scaling properly, but we divided this by million of the population to try to get at the scale issue, and so I agree we could log it and maybe it would look better. But
and what's the y-axis again?
this is our political polarization Google Ngrams times 100,000.
Okay.
So we have these measures of legislative productivity. So we want to see if like polarization is associated with like less getting done in Congress. And so these guys constructed a measure of legislative productivity, essentially number of bills that get passed, and like amount of legislation passed and major legislation passed. And it does look like this is like the strongest results in the paper was like the more polarized Google Ngrams, not necessarily Congress, is the less efficient Congress is. And it turns out in the regression table, it's like this is robust to controlling for the congressional political polarization. So it looks like it's it's this sort of measure of cultural polarization that's actually driving, I guess maybe this is American democracy at work, is that it's actually when people actually hate each other in the real world, that's when you don't get policy getting made. It's not so much just that you have polarization among congressmen, it's actually like you need sort of like cultural polarization. Maybe, I don't know, none of this is identified. Okay, so now the last thing we did, we wanted to test this mutual determination of congressional speech and political discourse. So is it the idea that political language comes out of intellectuals and flows into Congress, or does it come out of Congress and then get adopted by intellectuals? And so what we're going to do is we're going to explore this with these phrase-level dynamic panel regressions, where we essentially take the frequency of a phrase in Congress and we regress it on lags of the frequency of a phrase in Google, together with interactions of the frequency of the phrase in Google times the quartile of the polarization of that phrase. So we're going to take phrases and we're going to rank them by, are you in the first lowest 25%, next lowest 25%, 50 to a 75th percentile, and then 75th to 100th percentile of the polarization distribution, and interact the frequency with that. And so then we're going to control for the lags of Congress, of the frequency of phrases in Congress. Then we're going to control for phrase fixed effects and Congress fixed effects. These are like year fixed effects. And then we're going to run the same regression, except with Google as the outcome and Congress as the independent variable. So the idea and the hypothesis is that essentially if Google is influencing, if political phrases are moving from Google to Congress, then we expect that in the highest politicization quartiles, you'll get significant coefficients on the frequency of Google phrases then getting passed along into the frequency of congressional phrases. But if it's Congress sending things into Google, then you'll get significant coefficients on the highly politicized phrases in Congress getting passed along into Google. And so this is essentially what we get. So this is this is when the dependent variable is Google frequency of a phrase at time t, and we essentially don't get very much here. We get that when Congress is using a phrase more frequently, you then sort of see it in Google, in the Google frequency. But then when you look across these quartiles, you get maybe a negative effect here, but it's not terribly robust. So this is when we split things up pre-1941, post-1941. This is when we look at economic phrases only, where we define it narrowly. This is where we look at economic phrases broadly, and this is where we look at like social phrases. So there's not super amounts that's clear here, but when you look here, and you get that essentially like the politicized phrases in Google are getting transmitted into Congress was our takeaway. So if you look at these 50th to 75th quartile and the 75th to 100th quartile, this is sort of where the phrases look like they're getting passed along into Congress. And again, so we didn't find anything on these economic and social phrases. We actually got a negative on this social phrases. So I don't have an explanation for that. But we were at least sort of selling this as this idea that politicized language looks like it's moving from Google into the Congress, as opposed to much more so than it's moving from Congress into Google. So if anything, like the most politicized phrases are negatively, are like less likely to be passed along from Congress to Google than vice versa. Okay, so just to like we're like, this is super speculative, and like there's tons and tons of limitations and lots of other ways things that be going on. So the purpose and structure of congressional speech might have been changed in ways that are not captured by our measures. So like, there parties essentially started giving at some periods, like they let people have 2 minutes of unstructured floor time, and they could just spout off. And then there's media coverage of the floor, so like C-SPAN comes online in like 1987, and like you can imagine that now having your speech getting broadcast into cable networks all over the country changes how you talk. The relationship of books and political discourse to congressional speech may have changed over time. We're probably not using the most informative representation of the language, and we're probably not extracting the best signal of partisanship, and I think we're still trying to figure out what the best methodology to do this is. And the contents of Google Books might be a very coarse proxy for political discourse. It's just like whatever books that Google decided to digitize, get its hands on, who knows what's exact. I'm not even sure Google entirely knows what's in the Google Books corpus. But there's lots to be done with this, so you can take this to all these other domains, like newspapers, radio transcripts. We were looking for church sermons for a while, and so an interesting thing is to like score the religiosity of actually take the church sermons and use it to score congressmen on how close they sound to church language, see if you can pick it up in congressional speech. You can do this method on press releases. Obviously, there's the selection into the Google corpus, and so one of the things we were really excited about was trying to construct this think tank corpus. So if we're able to do that, we will. Yeah, I guess essentially we think this data in this toolkit is useful for quantitatively studying like sort of how political ideas move back and forth across these domains and tracking sort of the evolution of culture in a quantitative way. All right, that's it.